Hi, I'm Katie Smith-Millway. I'm president of the Endeavor Global Club, which is co-producing this webinar with the International Directors Network, another global club, in our role as both support and diffuser of awareness, of advocacy, and action related to sustainability across national alumni associations and the other global clubs. And so in this case, we just want to thank Women in Business Club and also the Alumni Association of Switzerland for co-promoting this event. And we look forward to working with any other club representatives that are on this call on related topics. Over to Pam, who has really done all of the legwork in terms of putting together this panel. Thanks a lot, Pam.
Thank you very much, Katie, and very welcome to everyone to this panel webinar, ESG and Governance, the Materiality of Board Leadership. We have got 4 stunning panelists today, and more about them they'll explain themselves shortly. But let me introduce briefly how I run this webinar. You will have a chat function at the bottom. And as you may have heard me previously saying, please ensure to keep your mic muted. There are quite a few people on the call, and we'd like to be able to provide as good a sound quality for everyone as possible. So if you have questions, concerns, or would like to direct something specific to one of the panelists, please use the chat box. I have the chat box open here on my other screen, and we'll follow the conversations there and pick up the questions, and from round 2 pitched into the panelists themselves. But let's get started immediately in the midst of things. Boards of directors are, in many jurisdictions, if not possibly all that we know of, the ultimate responsibles of a company's action. And in the surge of the last years, legislation in the regards to ESG and sustainability has increased significantly, not just in Europe, as you might think, but really across the world. And yet the question remains, what is exactly the role of boards in this context? What skills do they need? How can they successfully steer a company through this increasingly complex topic while doing what they're expected to do, which is preserving the company's? And in this context also, what is the value add and the difference between ESG and sustainability? ESG being an outside-in view, and here at the example of reporting, and sustainability being the inside-out view of how you do things, much akin to management accounting. What is the difference of either of those two relative to legal compliance with this new type of legislation that's going to come up? These topics are all linked together, as you can see on this slide. And this timeline perspective, if you want to see it that way, is an extremely dry summary of a much more fascinating story, not the least for the role of boards. So on the board's leadership too is Frederik Otto. He'll introduce himself shortly. But Frederik, what do we know in terms of this material topic and how this has been present on boards or not over the last few years?
Yeah, thanks, Pamela, and thanks for having me. Hello, everybody. My name is Frederik Otto, the founder and executive director of the Sustainability Board, a think tank on sustainable leadership and corporate governance. Started in 2019, and we're just short of our 5th anniversary, which is coming up in July. So what is the importance of sustainability and ESG on the board level is probably not something that we have to talk about for a long time. What is the importance of sustainability risk and sustainability opportunity? Essentially, it's just the question, what is the importance of risk and opportunity to be governed by the board? So we publish a report that looks at preparedness in general, sustainability preparedness, and we've been running this for 5 years. So the way that we define sustainability preparedness is, does the board have a oversight policy defined? And that stood at about 50% of the largest organizations in 2019. So only half of the largest companies in the world actually had a board policy defined on sustainability or ESG. And end of last year, that was then at 88%. So we've seen huge strides in that part of preparedness. The second piece is, where does the accountability sit on a board? And we look specifically at the committee level. And we don't think that you need to have a specific sustainability committee. It's also fine to have oversight responsibility as part of a governance committee or a nomination committee or risk committee or whatever suits your board best. And then we look at the directors that are tasked with oversight on these committees. And again, at 2019, that we looked at 16% of these directors being engaged on sustainability or have a sustainability credential, as we called it back then. And 4 years later, that is almost at 50%. Committee chairs, whether it's a dedicated committee or whether it is a shared committee, also stand around 50% of ESG engagement. So that is obviously concerning. That tells you that only every second committee chair tasked with oversight, as well as the directors on this committee, actually are engaged on the topic. So, and the third piece then is the entire board knowledgeable about ESG. And we think there should be the default that all of the directors should have a baseline understanding of sustainability, but that is often not the case. As you can see in the committees, we already have the issues that the people actually tasked with the oversight do not have the engagement. And we measure this on a checklist. I won't go into detail now. You can find that on our website. This is all in relation to material sustainability issues, of course. Every organization has a different equation to solve and has different issues they should worry about. Could be environmental, could be social, could be both, or either of them. I want to leave you with one little mnemonic that I find is quite helpful. The discussion has much shifted from opportunities to risks. Over the last year, we've seen war, we've seen AI coming into the global environment, and organizations tend to be much more concerned on risk. And no matter what your sustainability issues are, think about it in a new abbreviation, and this is not supposed to be a framework or anything, but it's just supposed to be helpful. I call it change. C stands for climate change, H stands for human rights, A stands for AI, N stands for nature, G stands for geopolitics, and E stands for equality. So no matter what your sustainability issues, material issues are, make sure that you monitor all of the developments within change, because I think that will be the definition of where business is going into the future. And my last point is there's, of course, a difference in accountability scope between the size and type of organization. Is it a public organization? Is it a private organization? Is it a family business? And we have new research coming out in just a month's time that will show that family businesses actually have a much more defined culture, and they're leading more through their culture on sustainability rather than on policy or driven by regulation, etc. So there's, of course, differences, but overall, I think thinking in risk terms is really helpful. And it doesn't really matter what your organizational setup is or your ownership structure is. The final point that I'll make is a stakeholder governance or stakeholder engagement framework is helpful. If you are a private company, you don't have so many stakeholders that you're responsible for. You have a more intimate relationship with your investors. If you are a public company, obviously your stakeholder landscape is much wider, and hence it's always helpful to review your stakeholder engagement or governance framework.
Thank you,
Pamela,
Frederik. Much appreciated. And you left us already with the pointer towards challenges that the boards face and have to address. And this is really a question I'd like to direct to Jessica. You in particular, because Jessica, you're also in a geography where sometimes certainly from Europe, finger pointing is happening towards Asia. as being, you know, a challenge in that topic. And yet some of the most interesting case studies come out of Asia at the same time. So I would like to hand the word to you now, and really talk a little bit about what you have seen around Asia from where you are in your experience, around the challenges, but also the successes that you can share with us and the whys behind them.
Thank you very much, Pamela, and thank you to INSEAD for inviting me. I'm one of the INSEAD alumni and finished the IDP program last year. Hello from Singapore. It's about 9:12 p.m. here, and I'm very glad to join all of you here to give you some perspectives from Asia, which, as Pamela has mentioned, is quite a complex picture where I sit. I also serve on the ESG committee for the Singapore Institute of Directors, so I do have a frontline seat at, you know, what are some of the issues that directors and boards really grapple with. And, you know, perhaps I can start that with saying that it really is down to capacity building and competencies. I serve on 2 SGX listed boards here in Singapore. And when I look around the landscape here, the director landscape, there are some that really have, you know, been working in this field for a long time, but a large swathe of directors really are just starting to understand these issues. And boards, I think, know that sustainability and ESG issues have now climbed to the top of the corporate agenda, you know, thanks to regulations. You know, the EU is leading on that, but also domestic jurisdictions and disclosure landscapes are also changing drastically. But where boards are in Asia really largely has been through a compliance lens. And Pamela, I chuckled when you showed that slide on sustainability doesn't equal compliance, because many organizations begin with a compliance lens because they have to, you know, get their house in order, ensure that they are fulfilling their duties. But the journey to actually showing proactive leadership is still quite a complicated one. I think if you look at what directors have to grapple with, they have to play an increasingly huge role in addressing our global energy transition, addressing climate change mitigation, adaptation, rising inequality, many of the issues that Frederik mentioned in his change acronyms. And what directors really are concerned about is that they have increasing legal obligations and fiduciary duties that are related to the financial risk and opportunities presented by climate change and sustainability issues. Many of them, I don't think, even fully comprehend the legal responsibility that they have. And in this region, there has been, you know, less so than the EU in terms of climate litigation, but this is definitely something that has been talked about a lot. And there has been legal opinions being issued in Singapore. I think there was one in Japan as well, that basically said that directors have to fulfill their fiduciary duty by looking at these issues and also disclosing what they're doing on them. So in terms of, you know, back to the competency thing, I think that capacity building is the huge challenge for boards here in Asia Pacific. Some countries are a little ahead. Singapore, where I am, they are a little ahead because we had issued disclosure regulations earlier. And ACRA and SGX, which are regulatory bodies here, have started even mandating non-listed companies that are large enough to have to start to disclose. In Malaysia, for example, is a little more behind. They've just issued its first public consultation to adopt the ISSB standards. But where I sit, I think what the ISSB and disclosure standards have done is they've really put this issue into the agenda at boardrooms, which used to be like, you know, the last agenda item in board meetings. But now, because they are, you know, mandated to really sign off on board statements and on ESG data, they have to, you know, talk about this a lot more in depth. And Frederik had mentioned, you know, some statistics, and I wanted to share also that in a recent SGX and NUS Business School study, we've seen an encouraging number of issuers. So 94% of issuers in the financial year 2022, its sustainability reports, you know, said in their board statements that sustainability is part of strategic formulation, and that involvement in determining ESG factors also rose from 48% of issuers in 2021 to 75% in 2023. So this is a really encouraging sign. And I think that sustainability governance is definitely on the rise in Asia Pacific. But I think where real integration of sustainability principles and business models, you know, this is something that we've yet to see. And in some organizations. You asked about success stories. I think if you look at the Dow Jones Sustainability Index and which Asian companies are on there, those are the companies that have kind of been quite enlightened around sustainability governance and have done things like declared a science-based targets, validated in the SBTi targets. They have short and medium-term targets as well for decarbonization, as well as very articulated policies. They have very concrete transition plans being articulated, and also identifiable financial flows and investments going into sustainability-related topics. So I think, you know, while it's extremely encouraging to see these things, in Asia, there is also a very complicated discussion going now, and you can see that pushback in the conversation, like in India, for example, saying that climate change should not be considered in trade rules, and that in Indonesia, for example, where they have massive energy transition investments, that they want to consider coal investment as green, which is obviously, you know, caused a lot of backlash. But the picture is extremely tough because Asia is in many stages of development, and livelihoods are still the #1 economic driver and KPIs for many listed organizations. So they still see sometimes sustainability progress as coming at a cost to economic growth and livelihoods and jobs, top line, bottom line. And I think that that's something that still needs to be managed. And one of the things that emerged in this region is this thing called transition finance, where there is a very clear phased approach to helping organizations transition out of, you know, high emission, high impact industries. And at the end of the day, I think, you know, we are seeing articulation of the quantification of risks. Frederik had touched on that a little bit, of losses, damages to organizations, and that has enabled boards to sort of really comprehend what's at stake here. And in, you know, a lot of the sessions that I lead with the directors here in this region, I talk about good governance and long-term value creation, because at the heart of it, it all comes down to that. And the rise of the sustainability agenda really is a license to operate, building resilience and long-term value, gaining competitive edge, and, you know, shaping a better society. So I think my last point here is that investors and shareholders play a huge role in this. In the boards that I serve, a lot of initiatives had been accelerated because we received letters from institutional investors, many based in Europe, asking our board, what are we doing on diversity, ESG, decarbonization? And that really helps to move the needle here in Asia. And boards are ultimately answerable to shareholders. So I think shareholders really need to speak up. So I'll pause there. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And really, really relevant to make the point, one, to the shareholders, and two, how actually stock exchanges and sometimes their ratings and how they cajole people around, like the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, can be a good jumping off way to figure out what's happening also in different geographies. Kiku, I'd like to hand the word to you next. You, up until now, often sat on the other side of the non-exec board as an executive director. You know, there are different experiences that come out of that, and yet you're very close to the responsibilities of non-executive directors. What has been your experience in sitting on the other side as a you know, a fighting partner for those non-exec boards, and what is the lessons you got away with?
Yeah, well, hello everyone, and thank you, Pamela, for inviting me to this very interesting panel. So a little background on me: I have been a sustainability professional for more than 20 years. I've worked for very large publicly listed corporations. I've worked within conservation NGOs, and I've also worked as a consultant to businesses on sustainability matters and sustainability strategy. So I've really lived this subject from the inside out, and from the very beginning, when we called it corporate social responsibility, and people really didn't know what we were talking about, to now where we're really concretizing it into, for lack of a better words, ESG. In the early days, the community was creating the business case from the bottom up. The community, I would say, was composed of people from companies on the employee side, from smaller NGOs and nonprofits, activists, We are really doing this without much support from the board level. So it's a great conversation to have now to see how the board can support this movement from sort of shareholder value to stakeholder values. So I just wanted to say, I'm in Barcelona. I'm at a conference for the UN Ocean Decade, and I was at a panel on deep sea mining yesterday, and someone asked the panel if capitalism was broken. And the answer was, immediately someone said, yes, it's broken. But then immediately someone also said, no, it's not broken. Capitalism is functioning exactly as it was designed to function. But it is society that has to define the rules within which capitalism has to act. So, you know, in the 1970s, Milton Friedman set those boundaries in his very influential Friedman Doctrine, where he argued that a company has no social responsibility outside of its responsibility to its shareholders. Well, I think that with climate change, with the extreme biodiversity crisis that we're experiencing, we now have proof to show that this thesis is effectively no longer useful. And we've busted through the safe zones for like 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. We all know that we're feeling the effects of climate change, and whether you are a customer of a company, whether you're in the business, running the business, a board member, whether you are an employee of a company, we're all feeling this. And so I think that we've really confronted the ultimate tragedy of the commons. But society has the opportunity to reshape the guidelines for corporations. And I think that's what ESG is doing. So, you know, we've created the social contract for corporations, and, you know, this ESG is a new framework that's saying, well, society has more responsibility, not only to its shareholders, but also to the stakeholders around it. And I firmly believe that there is really no turning back to the days when we all just had to worry about shareholder value. And it's also my belief that this is going to bring long-term value for companies. ESG is effectively leveling the playing field, and all these rules and regulations that we can talk a lot about and that are confusing to a lot of people to try to implement, they're all an attempt to create those boundaries, those societal boundaries around which companies, within which companies must act to create value and do the activities that they have set out to do, which are also important to society. So really is the time of stakeholder value, and whether or not we like it, we do have to embrace it. And I believe that those who do embrace it may find great value, great long-term value and durability for companies, for their company. So I thought about what is the so what for boards, and I really have some very simple advice. And it comes, you know, 3-part advice. First of all, is just do it. ESG should be fully integrated into your strategy and it's connected to your purpose as a company and connected to your values as a company. Just see that as a board member, you have a fully integrated strategy. It should be threaded throughout the organization. You have to address your risks, of course, your impacts, and also the opportunities that you have for value creation. How is it going to affect your business model? Ask how it's going to affect your supply chain. How is it going to affect your customers? And how important is this for your employees who are increasingly more interested in working for companies that are doing something better for society? Second, integrate this into your board. Make sure that you have a fully articulated board strategy, like Frederik Otto has already discussed. So whatever the structure is that you implement within your board, that's fine, whatever you're comfortable with, but make sure that you have the capacity, that you have the structure, and that you're addressing all the aspects of ESG. There are plenty of resources for that, like Chapter 0, where you can go to upskill your board members. And I think finally, we've made a lot of commitments as companies, but implementation is really the game now. And it's a lot harder than it looks. So as a board member, help your companies implement instead of just talking about their commitments. You may want to set targets, you may want to make grand pronouncements, but it's really hard to implement. Coming from a practitioner's perspective, it is very hard. There are lots of ins and outs, and there's going to be struggles and challenges along the way. I hope that as board members, you know, you can support your executive team in confronting those challenges and really being transparent with those challenges with you. Give them a lot of leeway to explain to you what their challenges are and how they're going to be addressing them.
Thank you very much, Kiku. Which actually brings me, you mentioned it very nicely, the question that was brought up on your conference there yesterday, and I think it makes a neat segue to Ludo. In a sense, this is a revolution in business to a certain extent, what we're experiencing right now. Ludo, with what you've seen over the years in business over the course of your trajectory as both a businessman as well as, importantly, an INSEAD director, what is your take on what's happening right now in business around this topic of ESG/sustainability?
Yes, well, I think it's sort of been well described, Pamela. Thank you very much. And I'm here at the Delphi Economic Forum, so if there is noise, I try to find a quiet place, but there may be people running around and making too much noise. But I think for me, the big change is that governance is now a word that is the other side of the coin from business execution and implementation. And that realizing that we come from a world where basically the view was business is all about execution. And now we have entered a world where, you know, you need to govern the corporation because the corporation can do harm. It can do harm to the earth, can do harm to society. It can do harm to society in many ways through trying to seek monopolies, through relationship with the government, etc. So in a certain way, we're trying to, we're realizing finally that many of the execution problems, many of the bad results are actually results of governance. And that actually then we realize that the responsibility for the board, for a corporation lies with the board and not with the shareholders. That I think is the key notion of capitalism, that you couldn't trade responsibility, therefore stock markets couldn't operate if shareholders were responsible. And so we are now making boards responsible. I think that is sort of an awareness first. Now we actually need to sanction board members, you know, who would be actually not doing due diligence. So I think that is a big revolution, and I think that is basically saying the same thing as what is true in democracy, which is no individual can do harm to another person, and no corporation can do harm to anyone. And I think that's sort of a very, you know, in a certain way, a new notion, because corporations are only about business, and the answer is no. Corporations are about value creation, and corporations are social institutions. I think that's very, very important. So the corporation is not there for shareholders. Shareholders provide the equity, provide the initial investment, but corporations are there for people, and everybody wants something from a corporation. Government wants taxes, shareholders want dividends, CEOs want bonuses and stock options, and suppliers want to have low cost, etc., and customers want low prices. So the board is there to balance, you know, or to avoid imbalances. I think that's really important. And the boards are the corporation. From a legal viewpoint, boards are the corporation. So, you know, now the reality still is that most of the time it's executives who go to jail. But we're probably going to enter a period where actually board members will be punished. Probably more name and shame. You should not be associated with a company that has gone through bankruptcy, for example, or that has committed fraud. And that's a very simple rule. It's a democratic rule because we need justice, and I think we're not there at all. So I think that would be for me the next thing. I think I want to defend Milton Friedman a little bit because, and then I want to attack economists. Friedman basically said that he assumed that there was no externality, so that there was no such thing as pollution. So in that world, his paper was actually not for shareholders. His paper, actually, if one reads it, it says CEOs are running the company for themselves and not for society, if you wish, and not for the shareholders. So basically, he says you need to measure and control CEOs because they're running the show for themselves. For example, when InBev bought Anheuser-Busch, they realized they had bought an airline company, 53 planes. That was only because, people like to fly and because the owners like to fly. So Milton Friedman says you need control. Of course, because it's America, there was no mention of boards, but it was really shareholders need to control CEOs. And of course, now we know that it's boards that need to control executives, and that indeed shareholders need to control boards. And there you come to the big divide. And I think that's something that is not sufficiently done. We've written about that with Massimo Massa, is that there are two worlds. One is owner-led. Let me just say private equity, let me say family firms. These are the great examples in sustainability because family firms have always been responsible, have always looked at communities, have always looked at stakeholders. So it's not a surprise that the best examples are in family firms. If we go to Switzerland, it's Hoffmann La Roche, it's Givaudan, it's others. So family firms, I think, are the great examples typically because they're owner-led and because, this is my major point, because they put sustainability in the mission of the firm, which is basically, it's not just what do the board's members want, but what do the owners want. And the problem with publicly listed firm is dual. There are too many owners, they have no power, and they don't agree. So as soon as a company like Unilever puts up a sustainability policy, it's going to create friction with the shareholders because most shareholders don't agree on sustainability. So de facto, Unilever was executive-led. It was Pullman who was running the show, and I think I think we should get away from the idea that we run companies for shareholders. That's still a notion that my colleagues in finance preach. It's actually toxic stuff, because you run companies for people and for customers because customers pay for everything, and shareholders are like Swiss farmers, which is their milk. And also they provide a little bit of grass for the cows, for the pasture, for the cows to graze. So I think there is a big divide between owner-led firms where owners define sustainability. What is their impact? What do they want to know for? And they don't want to be known to be toxic. And then secondly, so-called market-led firms, which are truly executive-led firms. And then I come back to Friedman. Friedman was the first one to say be worried about the executives. They're going to run the show for themselves. Now, because he was American, he didn't know about boards because Americans don't believe in boards. They hardly believe in democracy, as we can see on TV. It's a big debate. And I think my final comment is ESG is it is a bit of a confusing concept, because basically it was introduced by asset managers for long-term investment. And they basically say you should look at governance, you should look at societal impact, and you should also look at the environment. But you should not forget that the basic logic of corporations, the energy of corporations, is the money. So I am a much bigger defender of the triple bottom line, because it is what we need to get to is what is the impact of a company on the economic side, because that is the energy. Secondly, what is the impact on people? A lot, salaries, taxes, etc. And then finally, what's the impact on the earth? And I think that's where I would like to go. And I think I will finish by saying it's a measurement issue. That is what boards need to be, right? If that is imposed by owners, it's easy, because then the owners say that's what we want. Otherwise, we change the board. If it's the market is extremely confused. And then finally, you're going to converge on making money, or you must have a stable group of shareholders who have control over the company, and then who can do what family firms do, that's what we mean by sustainability, and that's what we tell our executives not to do. And family firms are very good at making trade-offs between interest of communities, which is the S. E, which is future dividends and future investment, and then also the earth. Let me finish by the final comments. Economics has been conceived as a closed system, input, output, markets, balance. And in fact, the earth is not a closed system, which is the most toxic product today is a microchip. The most energy consuming product is blockchain. Everything requires energy. And so the world is not sustainable because the world is transforming itself all the time. And sustainability for me means, one, managing this transformation so life on the planet is sustainable. That is really, I think, for me, the key. And that's where I would love to, that's where I think we need to go to governments who say, what is your impact on the energy equation? How much waste, how much pollution do you bring? How much stuff do you deliver that creates big problems? And so this is not an issue only for corporations, it's also an issue for government. And that is also what Friedman said, which is externalities cannot be solved by corporations, because then that would actually go against the economic logic. We need to have clear, rules and regulations. And I think that's probably where Europe is leading a little bit more, because you cannot trust the markets, to come up with the right policies. And we should not forget that, in every transformation, there's waste, and that is the energy equation. So the fuel of companies is money, but to get money, you need to have a lot of energy. And I think paying more attention to the physical side of things, which no economic model does, and that's what ESG is calling for, is, I think, fundamental. So I think for me, the key measure would be biodiversity, forcing every company to have an impact, to have a statement of impact on biodiversity of the planet, because for me, that's the easiest measure. Because if we destroy biodiversity, ultimately, we will destroy ourselves. Whereas if we grow biodiversity, then life on the planet is healthy. So basically, that would be my wish, but it's just one wish, it's just one comment. But I would like to see more reporting on impact on biodiversity, more for the medium and long term. And of course, CO2 reporting, because the climate change is the short-term issue. And I think everybody is either contributing to the climate change or not. But we're not going to solve it unless there is regulation. And that, for me, the big partnership that is needed is public-private partnerships, industry partnerships with government, which is saying what kind of industry do we tolerate, what kind of industry do we wish, and so that within the industry there can be competition, because you cannot punish companies for being sort of more sustainable and then actually making them less competitive. So basically, there are some of my comments. I'm a professor, so I'm too long, so I will forfeit any other time that I may have in this.
Thank you. So I thought it was really neat how you already got into the definition of sustainability, because one of the questions we had was, I'm curious how sustainability is being defined. What knowledge beyond risk and regulations, for example, responsible sourcing, green business models, and so on and so forth. I actually would like to direct that question directly to Kiku and possibly Frederik to have a short stab on what is your view of what such a definition could or should be.
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's very relevant. We talk about ESG as a shorthand, I think, for kind of a 360 view of the impact that a company has on the world, on society, on environment, and on social justice. I think that in terms of a framework, it's been worked over quite a bit by ISSB, by the GRI, and I think the CSRD has actually done a very comprehensive job in helping us to create a framework that helps us to examine a company from a company point of view, what sustainability is, find what your material issues are, both from a financial materiality perspective and also on your impacts on society and the environment. So I think that just shorthand, CSRD has a really great framework that that's at least a great starting point. And for all those European companies, it's going to be a necessary one because you'll have to start reporting next year. But there's a lot of research. There's been a lot of years put into developing, the components. I think what you have to do is really examine what impacts are relevant to your company, and that's the materiality analysis, and what we call double materiality. But I won't go into detail on that. Take a look at this.
That can cover hours of discussion, as we know from what the EU provides. There's another question that I said, there are 3 questions that I actually tried to get to tie up to one. One was around who's owning, or actually all of them go around who's owning the topic on the board. Risk committees, CSR committees, strategy committees, in different geographies and jurisdictions on the one hand, but then also the role of the CEO and the CEO compensation, hence the remuneration committee on the board, that obviously is the one who sets the KPIs in terms of what the CEO's compensation looks like. And then also a bit the question is like, ESG is a very operational thing. Sustainability is a very operational thing in actually doing it. And here I would also like to get Jessica in then. It's like, well, where does that sit eventually in that interplay between the execs and the non-execs? And maybe Jessica would like to go first, and then Kiku and possibly Frederik can chime in.
No, thank you for that question. I think that it is a responsibility that starts with the board articulating where that responsibility sits. And I think in our region, we've seen an increase of board sustainability committees being formed where the chair and the CEO are also members. I chair a board sustainability committee in one of the boards I sit on, and then I'm a member in the other. And in both, we have an executive committee as well that joins the meeting. And I think that to have that committee give direct oversight on specific issues, whether it's ESG data collection, harmonizing it with financial data right now with the mandates of ISSB, this has been really important. And one of the interesting things that we're seeing is that group internal audit, as well as the CFOs, are all starting to be involved in this committee meetings because there is a lot of data that's being, collected and articulated and disclosed. But there are also now requirements, for example, for the company to disclose what's the impact of impairment as a result of, climate change or sustainability related opportunities and risks. And so I think that it's a great sign to see that sustainability governance is being taken quite seriously at all levels of the organization. But I think the only thing I would say here is that we are seeing this being sort of accelerated among listed companies, and there's a large swathe of private companies or even listed companies that have been taken private that have so-called got free ride because they no longer have to disclose or be in the public domain. And this is where I think the role of governments and regulators in ensuring that even companies of a large size who are not listed are actually on board. And in this regard, the EU is leading the way with, its compliance regulations and the CSRD. And I think that this is something that we'll continue to see more of.
Thank you very much. Frederik, would you like to chime in onto this? Because you have been looking precisely at the sustainability committees' existence or absence thereof of very large companies, but I'm sure you've also, in the course of things, seen how that is panning out across other sizes and types of companies.
Sure, and I don't think it's so important what committee is exactly responsible, what the committee is called. Our data shows that it's about 50-50 split. 50% of companies now have a dedicated committee that is either called the Sustainability Committee, CSR, or ESG Committee. And then the other half is either nomination, governance, a combination of that, risk, audit. Depends a little bit where in the world you look at. In the UK, for example, audit and risk committee often have responsibility. In the US, it's often nomination governance committee if it's not a separate one. So it's not so important what you call the committee, it's just important that there is a good charter that defines the oversight and the particular issues and responsibilities that the directors have. And then, of course, it is important that committee also meets with other committees, for example, the nomination committee or the REMCO, to discuss the long-term incentive plan. And I urge caution when it comes to ESG compensation. And there's obviously a lot of REM advisors that will be able to tell you more about that. But it's relatively easy to define a compensation at risk that is just a small amount, where executives either know how to trick the system relatively easily, or where it just doesn't matter and they can overachieve on in another pocket of their long-term incentive plans, which then invalidates really the weight of the ESG component. So don't worry too much about what you call the committee. In the chat, I've given the example of India. India mandates a CSR committee from a certain size of company. But what we often see is that there is an additional ESG or sustainability committee, as CSR is now mostly synonymous with a employee engagement exercise. It's more like a touchy-feely sort of exercise rather than it being a core part of sustainable strategy. That again depends a little bit where in the world you are. So that just shows that you have to mean it. It has to be business critical, and then what you call it is not so important. And then eventually the committees should talk to each other, and the overall board, of course, should be informed and should have a baseline understanding of what is happening.
Thank you, Frederik. One thing that came up and has been mentioned here in the comments as a question as well, and both as a question and an observation, I think it links extremely well back to what's just happened yesterday at the European Court of Human Rights. Around people may have not noticed that, but the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg has yesterday decided that climate change, respectively being negatively affected by it, is an infringement of human rights. So Switzerland as a country has been held guilty for Ludo, you've got your hand up. Just go ahead. Sorry, not seeing that. Just go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay.
This is the point. This is the point I wanted to make, which is the no harm rule. A government is there to protect the people, and it was actually quite surprising, that Switzerland was the first country attacked, and actually pointed to for not defending and not doing enough to defend the citizens. And I think that would be, for me, the sustainability obligation of a government. And that's why I think the corporate governments, so public-private partnerships are so much key. But I want to say that every board is unique. Every board is different. So don't sort of say that's the way we do it. I think that's not a great argument. And I think the more you tell board members what to do, the less they like it, the less they're committed. I think for me, I think we should go more to impact. In a certain way, economics worked well because people say, how much money do you make? And I think we should be much tougher, not on how good is your boards, how many members do you have, how many meetings do you have? This is sort of, in a certain way, diversion. It's important, but it is diversion. And these are process measures. The first thing is, what is your impact? How much biodiversity do you destroy? How much money do you create? How much value do you create? And not just value for shareholders and share price, but value for people, which is wages, which is taxes, etc. For example, I sit on the Ukrainian Naftogaz company, biggest gas company. Our financial results is roughly 20 billion hryvnia, but we do a wealth transfer of cheap gas to the people that is worth roughly 100 billion. That is an amazing wealth transfer obligated by the government and a public service obligation. But I think we should look at companies as not as sort of saying they are there for the shareholders. No, they're there for the people. And the question is, what value do you bring to people? And I think that accounting is important. And then I would just add, you know, you should not have illicit value. You should not take advantage of the earth by, for example, polluting and not being charged for that. You should not do, you know, pay wages below what is normally acceptable, etc. So I think we should do business without doing harm, and that is value creation. So value creation is not taking advantage of a particular situation. It's actually saying, you know, doing good while not doing harm. And I think that's where the public-private partnership, I think, should be done. And I find there's amazing inaction at the industry level, which is I see no industries who actually make a social pact with each other and with the public and saying that is the way we're going to compete. And that may have impact on our level of employment, but that is sort of our pact with the government. It's all about individual companies. And I think for me, don't be too harsh, you know, putting responsibilities on individual people. You know, I think there is an obligation also for the government and for the industry. And I think I see little action on the industry level. I see little action in terms of industry versus and government. And I think I would push much more on that dimension. But corporations can do a lot of harm, including, for example, when people commit suicide, you know, because they're being poorly managed, like was the case for Renault or for France Telecom. And I think we should be much more human and democratic in that sense. And don't forget, corporate governance is ensuring that corporations stay in line, which is that they are basically free to do enterprise, but not at the expense of other people or other corporations. They cannot actually benefit and benefit by doing harm. And corporate governance is about liberté, égalité for people and for corporations. And I think that's why corporate governance is important. It's actually, you know, ensuring that freedom of enterprise. And indeed, the earth is a fantastic washing machine. It's a fantastic resource provider. A key question, which is really a much more social question, is, you know, who does the mineral resources belong? You know, Australia has fantastic mineral resources, so God loves Australia. But do they belong to Rio Tinto? Do they belong to the Australian people? Or do they belong to the earth, which is to the people? You know, and I think these questions, I think corporations have and individual owners have received way too much, I think, rights. One of the questions of Ukraine, clearly Crimea, the invasion of Crimea was to get the oil and gas deposits of Ukraine in the Black Sea. You know, that was just a rip-off operation, and people allowed this to happen. So I think these are fundamental questions. I think it's great news that we're dealing with it, but we should not confuse business, and we should not get wrong answers. And for me, there's been too much greenwashing. There's been insufficient impact accounting. And I'm delighted that Europe is, for example, leading the way, forcing companies to have an ESG report or a CSR report. And companies will be held accountable for doing what they promise. I think this is very important. So it's no longer greenwashing. It's actually, what do you do?
Absolutely. And actually that brings me to sort of latch on to the conversation of what's happened yesterday and this is sort of going to be a very quick closing round through all the panelists very, very shortly. So what we've seen in the last few years, and yesterday was just a culmination of that really, even though it is a government that this time has been in the spotlight, it's not the first time. We've got agenda against the Netherlands a few years ago at the base of the Netherlands not precisely keeping to its climate commitments, being forced to cut further their emissions. The follow-up of that was, again, the citizens of Netherlands against Shell as one of the climate court actions that happened. And then most recently in the UK, albeit that has been chucked out of the courts as not being within the realm of the current Business Act in the UK, when the Shell board was taken to court, and it didn't go very far this time, which is one of the reasons why in the UK the Better Business Act is under discussion. But brief short round really a minute each. Is this the way we have to go to move fast at the timeline that we need? And I would like to just go the way we started off, very briefly, Frederik, followed by Jessica, followed by Kiku, and a very short final word by Ludo before we hand back to Katie to talk about what's coming up next for Endeavour. Frederik.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm not sure I want to comment on the Shell case, but I think just in general, I like to quote Alex Edmonds of the London Business School, who I think did fantastic work recently, and recommend his paper, Rational Sustainability. And he argues that it should just become part and parcel of everything that we do. And we might have heard that before, but he gives an example that I'm quite fond of quoting, and that is, don't ask yourself, should we as a board worry about sustainability risks? Just remove the word. Should we as a board worry about risk? That's the same thing. Another example would be, should we increase sustainability investment? Just remove the word sustainability. Should we increase investment? Probably not, because of diminishing returns. So don't always think about these words as something siloed or special or something that we now have to pay attention to. It is just part and parcel of everything that we do. And my final line is that, you know, we are the biggest capitalists because all we're trying to do is to sustain profits, right? We are after perpetual profitability. We are after prolonging something. That is all that sustainability really means.
Thank you. Jessica?
No, thank you. I think the Shell case and what we've seen with Switzerland is extremely interesting. I do know Client Earth really well, and they tried to set up, in Singapore and then eventually set up in Japan. But their mode of engagement in Asia is very different from in Europe, where they are actually filing lawsuits. And in Asia here, they are engaging with governments and actually offering capacity building to the judiciary to help them and use the legal frameworks to actually bring companies and organizations to task. So you see very interesting ways of legal mechanisms and regulatory mechanisms being forcing governments and organizations to act. And I think I agree with Ludo, it should not really come down to this stage, but unfortunately, we have seen, a lot of inaction, a lot of pushback. And in the case of the Shell case, I think it's a case worth watching because it has huge ramifications for directors, that you can be legally, sort of liable and found guilty of certain. I mean, I don't know if it's criminal activity now, the legal definitions haven't been really set, but inaction is something that you can be guilty of. So I think it's something that the directors definitely have to watch. Client Earth is actually launching a Asian toolkit for directors in June. And I've been interviewed in that study, and it's basically helping directors understand what their fiduciary duties are, and we will have to watch that very closely. I wanted to mention the US because I think with all this progress that's going on, what's going on in the US and the politicization of ESG and sustainability is quite sad to see. And many years ago, or a few years ago, when Larry Fink and BlackRock was issuing his letters to CEOs and boards, you could see that momentum in ESG investment and that criteria of how they choose the stocks that they invest was actually enabling quite a lot of action. But of course, what we've seen is that there has been a huge retreat by BlackRock, using that term because there are funds that are withdrawing their assets from them, and that's not helpful to the conversation. And this is something I think is also pertinent to watch, because some governments don't actually act in the interests of their voters and their citizens, and it's something that I think would be quite interesting for us directors. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And given the time, and actually the point where we just landed, and not the least, as I also said, was happened yesterday in Strasbourg, I think I would like to close at this moment with this statement of Jessica, which I think is very prevalent, very important for the context being, and actually hand back for this very short slide back to Kate before we close the webinar today. Thank you everyone for attending. It was a great pleasure to have you here. And I hope you've taken away a lot of relevant information for you. Katie.
Yeah, thank you, Pamela, and all our speakers. And this topic is to be continued at the Endeavor Annual Sustainability Summit for alumni in conjunction with the Community Impact Challenge, which is really our action arm. We're in a joint venture, and it's being supported by, as you can see from all the logos, many clubs and national associations. But our keynote, Compare Pair, will be actually speaking from the perspective of Microsoft as their Chief Sustainability Officer about ESG reporting. And how they're trying to help companies really tackle that, including the biodiversity impact. So there are many other topics, as you can see, cracking scope 3, AI and sustainable value chains, but know that ESG will be continued, and sign up if you can. It's virtual or in person at Station F in Paris, May 30th at 3 p.m., 3 to 7 p.m. For those in the US, there'll be a breakfast at the SF Hub in conjunction that will be having some of our panelists based there as well. So it's a high quality hybrid event, and we hope to see many of you. Registration is at our LinkedIn, which is just the Endeavor Global Impact Network on LinkedIn, and you can find registration there. Thanks a lot, Pamela.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you again to Frederik, Jessica, Kiku, and Ludo for being present today, sharing your very valuable input and learnings. And I wish everyone a good rest of your day, a good night to Asia, and a good long day to the US. Bye, everyone. Take care and have a good rest of your week.